And we do have a free local meat raffle. We have a meat bundle from Homegrown Meat Company out of Newark. So go ahead and enter in to win that, and I'll pick a number at the end of the night. So whoever gets picked gets to go home with a free meat bundle. And so we'll do that then. So I will go ahead and let Jim, when he's ready, he can come on up and start his presentation.
All right, thank you. Appreciate the invite to come up today. Appreciate you guys taking your time to come here. It's a nice library. When I said we were coming up to a library, I wasn't sure what to expect, but very nice facility. We're going to talk about, I know this is billed as kind of a cover crop workshop, so we're going to talk a lot about just cover crop management. That's kind of the specialty that I tend to work with. I'm labeled as a soil health specialist. Certainly get in the weeds a lot on soil health, but really I'm going to ground this who talks a lot about how do we manage cover crops, particularly in corn and soybean systems. So if you can read the title, you'll see that I'm pretty specific about how I title that. I'm talking about cover crop management, soil health, and commodity corn and soybean systems, because I'm going to drive some of those differences home as we go through this discussion about where we get our information can vary depending on the context of the person giving it. So I'm working primarily in these commodity corn and soybean systems. Very quick personal background on myself. I will read most of the things up there because I understand you guys probably can't really read that too well if it's not quite large enough. So hopefully we can at least see the pictures. But family farm down in Streeter, Illinois. We have a corn, soybean, beef cattle operation on the east side of town. Family farm, 6th generation, been around for a while. Spent some time actually selling cover crop seeds for what is now Pro Harvest Seeds. So that kind of got me, my initial actually run with cover crops was from the forage side for livestock. Got involved grazing the cattle on these, what would be annuals, not necessarily cover crops. And then, worked a lot with Pro Harvest. Eventually started working as a dealer for them for a while, really on that forage side of the cover crop side. And then went on to start doing some work for different organizations. Soil Health Partnership for the Illinois Corn, or National Corn Growers. And I'm currently actually working as an agronomist as a contractor for a number of different organizations in the state of Illinois. Most of them tied to the commodity organizations, Illinois Corn, Illinois Soybean Association, all kind of tied around conservation agriculture. So promoting soil health, promoting how we use these practices. The Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership is actually a coalition. It is a partnership. It is a group of all these organizations around the state that have come together. I think there's like 16 partners in it now. Corn Growers, Soybean Association, Farm Bureau recently joined. We've got the Nature Conservancy, American Farmland Trust, all kind of united together trying to work towards those goals, originally tailored around the nutrient loss reduction strategy and water quality. So that's how I'm here today, is with the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership to give this talk. But a lot of the information I will be talking about will be coming from my experiences with these other organizations. One of the big ones that I'm involved in right now, and where a lot of this information will come from and a lot of my experiences, is the 5-year transition program, which is part of the Precision Conservation Management program. So that's a program through Illinois Corn. If you're not familiar with PCM, I'd encourage you to take a look at what they're doing. I know they don't have a big presence up in this part of the state, but they do have hundreds of farmers involved in their program throughout the state of Illinois. They've gotten a lot of really good information over the years. They've been around since 2014. They collect they collect mostly management information and do economic analysis across the board. So when we start to have a conversation, for example, about does doing tillage give me a higher or lower yield, they have hundreds of years of data, and hundreds of site years of data was what I was going to go with there, but a lot of information from hundreds of farmers throughout the state of Illinois that can really kind of justify where we are when we're talking about should we add a tillage pass, should we reduce a tillage pass. Things such as nitrogen management using the MRTN rate. There's a lot of really good information in there that can justify economically using these practices. In the back, one of their pamphlets is here. It's called The Business Case for Conservation. This is a pamphlet on cover crop. I believe it's the one I have in the back is the one that they did specifically on cover crops, looking at the farmers in their program and how successful they have been with cover crops. Looking at the expense to put cover crops in, looking at the yield that they get as a result of that. But within that program, we have what's called our 5YT or 5-year transition program. This is looking at side-by-side comparisons. So again, as I sit here and talk about cover crops, a lot of it is coming from looking at hundreds of site years of side-by-side comparisons of cover crops. Originally started with the Soil Health Partnership, continuing on with PCM. If you could kind of see that little bubble up there, I know it's kind of small, but it's being able to walk fields and step across from a management system with cover crops directly across to a management system that does not have cover crops. We carry these programs to yield, so the farmers submit their yield data as geospatial files and we do an analysis on it. So one thing that we will see there is we're oftentimes going to pick up on pretty small yield differences. No, these are not replicated trials, so we do concede that, but nonetheless, when I start talking about giving advice in terms of cover crops, I'm going to be very wary of giving advice that may even result in a 5-bushel yield loss, because those are things that I've been able to see on these programs. Oftentimes, if a farmer managed a cover crop and you got 70 bushel beans, you might walk away and say, hey, I got 70 bushel beans, this was a really good deal. You might not realize you could have had 75 bushel beans. So when we talk about the pros or the successes or the cons and the problems, they're not always night and day. They're not always train wrecks, or they're not always home runs. Sometimes there's these nuances that we have to pay a lot of attention to and try to manage accordingly. I'm not going to spend a whole lot more time. I want to get to the meat of the program being actually about management, so I'm not going to talk a whole lot of time about motivation or why we should be here. That kind of gets to be that soil health talk. Looking at some of the successes, we're going to highlight a few things very briefly. I try to tell people I'm really not much of a soil health evangelist. I'm more of a catechist, meaning that once you've decided to do this for whatever reason, I'm here to help you adopt these practices. I prefer more the agronomic component of it, getting into the weeds on how we terminate, what species we use, how do we set up planters, all that different type of stuff. Nonetheless, to be successful in any way, you're going to need to set up some goals. You're going to need to have an idea that you want to work towards for this. This may sound like I'm oversimplifying things, but I do think it's extremely important. Probably 20 years ago when I first started going to these types of meetings, somebody used the expression of cover crops as a tool in the toolbox. I thought that sounded kind of corny. I've never really used that expression until I've gone back to it very recently. Because that idea, it is obviously very important, it is absolutely true that cover crops are a tool, but unfortunately, across the state of Illinois, a lot of us have went out and bought the tool and we don't really know what we're going for with it. Because of all these cost share programs, there's a lot of money out there, a lot of people giving us money to put cover crops out there. We're putting them in our fields, we're not necessarily having a clear goal in mind of what we want out of it. And I've worked with farmers over the years that's been kind of an issue. We get the cost share dollars out there, and then when the cost share dollars dry up, we don't continue the practice. Well, because we didn't know what we were really going after in the beginning. So we're going to do just a couple of minutes on setting some very quick goals so that can help us select our cover crops, that can help us decide how we want to manage those cover crops as we move on to the rest of the presentation. So these are going to be very tangible. Going back to the big long list I had up here, these are just, I know you guys probably can't read all those, but these are again just a scatter shot of different goals: nutrient loss reduction, erosion control, pest control, maybe carbon markets or cost share payments, although I usually make a point that that's probably not the best idea for your primary goal. Cost share payments are what they are called. They are there to help you share the cost once you've decided to do these practices. There are very few payments out there that really truly cover the cost of these practices. There are a few, and there's even a few more that have been announced recently that are probably incentive enough to adopt these practices. We need to have our other motivations to want to do this. So the three kind of easy targets that I'm going to put up there that we can really kind of justify, we can really quantify and say are worthwhile. Number one, to reduce nitrogen loss. I understand up in this area there's some more hillier ground, maybe the concern of nitrates through tile lines and the Gulf hypoxic zone may not be as big of a concern. I imagine there are still some concerns in local waterways and drinking water. I know you guys have some specific challenges up here that the rest of the state doesn't have. I've worked with a few farmers in this area. But nonetheless, nutrient loss reduction strategy, the loss of nitrates through tile lines throughout the state of Illinois is a big deal. We've done a lot of positive work in being able to quantify what we need to do to address that. Soil structure, this really gets to that heart of soil health. This is something everybody can see differences on their field. This is where we see less erosion. We see those great pictures of people, yesterday probably would have been a good day to go out and take some of those pictures. So we can kind of quantify and visually see those differences. And then kind of as a secondary, I talk about, using weed control, which the weed control for most of our management isn't going to be perfect, but it is beneficial. It's something that helps us out as we combat different weeds, resistant weeds. So getting back to that idea of cover crops being a tool, there are other tools to address this. So I know many farmers who have tried cover crops and they've had bad experiences, and they simply say, I'm not going to do cover crops anymore. I'm fine with that. I tell them, well, I have no issue with you not doing cover crops anymore, but what are we going to do to address the problem then? Because there are other solutions besides simply cover crops. I think you guys are having another talk in a couple weeks on regenerative ag. They're probably going to go more in depth on crop rotations, on livestock, on doing some more advanced concepts like that. Those are other great ways to address these issues. We use cover crops because at the end of the day, we're in a kind of a corn and soybean system. And we need some answers that are going to address these problems in a corn and soybean system. If we had long-term rotations, livestock, some of these problems wouldn't be as big of a deal. So these are a tool in the toolbox. The soil health side of things, I'm probably going to skip through this because I don't think you'll be able to see it very well. Hopefully you've all seen a rainfall simulator in the past. This was a little bit of a video. I don't know if it's going to play. You probably won't be able to see it too good, but these are very easy ways to visually show someone these differences that we can see. And these things I'll stand behind. There's a lot of promises. A lot of people will say, oh, there's been a lot of promises with cover crops that really haven't lived up to it. The benefits to soil structure and soil health, absolutely. And it really starts with no-till. We can get to a lot of these benefits simply looking at no-till systems. Adding cover crops can be more beneficial on top of that, but building soil structure starts with reducing tillage. The way these pans are set up, if you were able to watch that, is they have similar amounts of residue on them. The only difference is how well the healthy their soil is and how good their soil aggregation is. But maybe this will be a little bit better visual. This is a side-by-side trial where a farmer did some very shallow tillage with a vertical tillage tool. And you can see by doing even that little bit of tillage, we basically destroyed the soil structure for as deep as that vertical tillage pass went. So while the goal was doing some very narrow tillage here, what we have here is you walk out into the field, and on the left side, person's boots sink right down to that tillage depth. And right above that, where that tillage is done, is nothing but a soupy mess. Whereas going on to the other side of the field, you have nice, firm soil that's holding us up. It isn't compacted, it just has soil structure. And so these are some benefits that we can see. Weed control is another one. As I said, weed control isn't always perfect. And if you could see this picture up close, this is one of the side-by-sides we've worked on. It is actually a strip trial, so you can see some more cover crops as we go across it. But it gave a huge difference in holding back water hemp. Now, if you could see that up close, on the right side, you would notice there is still actually some water hemp in that rye. That is a cereal rye cover crop. You can see it was terminated fairly small. If we want to manage towards weed control, maybe we have to allow our cereal rye to get taller. Maybe we have to allow it to get, have to seed it thicker, mature more. But nonetheless, even if we terminate it early, we may still have some weeds out there, but we're slowing them down. And now when we're using something like our Enlist products, we can actually, or Liberty products, we can actually apply when they're on label, and we can actually get the darn thing killed rather than them getting away from us. So it can buy us some time. It can kind of play the role of a soil residual chemistry on its own. It can maybe help us get by with a little bit fewer herbicides. Again, for most commodity corn soybean growers, it's not going to be a silver bullet where we're getting away from using any herbicides. But we do know organic farmers, we know regenerative farmers who are getting paid more for how they farm than the quantity that they produce, and sometimes doing other practices with cover crops can really help them reduce weed costs to where they don't really have to use any herbicides at all. So those things are possible. We just have to keep in mind, if our goal as a commodity corn and soybean grower is getting paid on production, it may not be economical to do some of those practices. lastly, on the goal side of things, before we move on, the nitrate, reduction in nitrate loss. These are a resource that have been put together by NREC through some of the research that has been done. I think at least in you put together a sheet with some barcodes, and I believe this is one of those on there. So you can look this up online. I fortunately only have a couple of physical copies, but these are a really good basic cover crop guide. They're going to give you some very basic advice on how to start with cover crops, but there's also some really good research in here where they're monitoring tile lines based on both nitrogen applications and then whether or not they have cover crops on them. So they were able to do these replicated trials. Most of them are done at Eric Miller's farm down in Monticello, Illinois, so it's on some pretty high quality soils. So they're also carrying things to yield, and there's absolutely no way you're reading what's on the right up there, but basically what that is quantifying and what is in this book is they're able to start saying how big does our cover crop have to be in order to make differences towards the nutrient loss reduction strategy. So this is huge to me because now I can give you a better goal of where your cover crop needs to be. So if we're talking about cereal rye, for example, and we would like to completely address nitrogen loss in our field to the point where we would meet the nutrient loss reduction strategy. I apologize if you don't know the numbers behind that. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to do that, but it is calling for a significant reduction in tile nitrates leaving the state of Illinois. But they're able to quantify that we need about 2.5 tons of cereal rye to meet the need, but with as little as a half a ton of cereal rye biomass, we start to impact the nitrates leaving our tile lines. So we've all seen those fields of cereal rye that get away from us. They get 6 foot tall. You know, some guys like it that way, but that's probably going to be looking at about 6 tons of biomass. To get that 2.5 tons of biomass, we really only need to be looking at like 18 to 24 inches tall, which is much more manageable. And what we have seen in terms of yield is we're getting a lot more positive yield responses if we can reduce the amount of biomass, both in soybeans and obviously corn. Corn, we would never want cereal rye to get 18 to 24 inches. We want to be terminating it more at that 8 to 10 inches stage. The half ton of biomass is going to be more at that 8 to 10 inches stage of cereal rye. So common question from a farmer who's trying to manage cereal rye ahead of corn wants to say, am I really doing any good if I'm getting out there getting this terminated so quickly? We're starting to be able to say, yeah, you actually are getting some good out of having a fairly small cereal rye cover crop stand, at least insofar as it goes to reducing nitrate loss. And we've known for a while that those small cover crops can still do a lot in terms of controlling erosion. So anyway, if you pick up the resources sheet that she had available and want to look at that, there is some very good basic cover crop advice, and there's that good numbers on there to help us quantify where we can get to in terms of getting our cover crops and how we need to manage them. So, all right, so we really want to get into the discussion on cover crop seed selection and some termination things. So these are just kind of the bullet points you're thinking about adopting cover crops. Number one, we got to figure out what species and seeding rates we're going to use. Number two, how are we going to get the seed? How are we going to get the job done? When are we going to get it out there? Number three, how are we going to kill it? It always cracks me up that we're always worried about how do we get it to live and then how do we get it to die. But those are two very important things. We'll need to talk about how we manage that residue in the springtime, particularly on corn crops, but even to an extent on soybean crops. And then lastly, particularly again on corn, we need to understand nutrient management. We need to understand that these corn crops, when they are being planted into cover crops, particularly cereal cover crops, that they need more nitrogen. We need to understand that nitrogen cycle. They need more nitrogen up front. Let me correct that. We don't need more nitrogen overall. We just need to make sure that there's plenty of nitrogen available to that corn starting. And then we need to avoid those pest issues, which aren't always very straightforward. How many people raising cover crops have ever had an issue with voles up here? Or slugs? Anybody have issues with slugs, right? So again, unfortunately, some of the answers for that aren't always super straightforward, particularly as rescue treatments. You know, as farmers are used to rescue treatments, there's the problem, give me something to spray it and kill it. We have to manage these things ahead of time if we want to avoid a lot of those problems, because we can't really go out there as a rescue treatment to address it. This is just a basic, I threw this up, so I know lots of farmers, you give a 45-minute talk, you throw a lot of information out there, I've been approached after meetings. just tell me what to do. Like, I listen, you had a whole lot up there, but just give me a prescription. As farmers, we want prescriptions. We want to know, do A, B, and C. Unfortunately, with cover crops, that's never going to be completely true. We just can't do that. We're dealing with the biology of the soil, but we can get a little closer. So this is just what we've done on our farm. I actually switched this up a little bit in the last few years, but going ahead of soybeans, cereal rye. I've heard, if you guys have been to a meeting, you've heard somebody say cereal rye is a no-brainer ahead of soybeans. 10 to 15 years ago, I would 100% agree with that statement. Unfortunately, some things have changed in the last 10 or 15 years. We are planting our soybeans a whole lot earlier than we used to. When we were planting soybeans into cereal rye in the middle of May, 10, 15 years ago, it was pretty well all upside from that cover crop. We had our soils were warm, they were drying out, and we got a really good positive from that. Now that we're planting up a lot earlier, I'm a little hesitant to say it's a no-brainer, but it's still usually the most easily manageable cover crop. We just have to think through how we manage that residue a little bit. Seeding rates, you know, we're looking at about 40 pounds to the acre if we're planting it with our 15-inch Kinsey planter. So we've been using our planter to actually put our cover crops out there. Actually, last year I used a drill more, but we've gone back and forth with that. But you can actually use planters. There's some benefits to that, getting that spacing. I know cereal rye will grow whenever. You're going to hear that all the time. People talk about planting cereal rye Christmas Day and New Year's Eve. But ideally, we want it in earlier by November 15th. When we go to terminate it, if at all possible, we want to watch our tank mixes. We want to use straight glyphosate and avoid some of those residuals in there. And we're going to go through each of these bullet points as we go along. I'm trying to give you the answer first, and then go through and kind of talk where these answers come from. We're going to terminate it at about 18 inches to 24 inches, or at least prior to the boot stage or around the boot stage. And then we're either going to plant green or we're going to come back 10 days after termination. And we'll come back through and we'll talk through each of those. But like I say, I like to kind of give the recipe up front that we're driving towards, and then we're going to go through each of these steps as we do this. So what determines our species selection, right? So this is the first thing. What species do we want out there? And the most obvious thing would be to go back and look at our goals and say, well, what do we want out of it? And this, I would like to say that's the first step we should do. Most farmers would probably want some nitrogen production, so right away we could dive into wanting to put legumes out there and making that work. Unfortunately, even though our goals are extremely important, there's a lot of things that end up trumping putting a lot of these different species out there. Number one, it has to be able to overwinter and grow and thrive during that time we have to grow it. As I said, I'm talking primarily corn and soybeans. Up here, wheat might play a role, though, so there could be some options there. But in corn and soybeans, it's really difficult to get a lot of these species planted early enough that they will establish an overwinter and be able to give us some production that next year. We need to think through that compatibility for the next cash crop. And those of you who have used the Midwest Cover Crop Council selector tool, we'll try to touch on that if we can. That's one of the biggest shortcomings it has, is it does not talk about there's no way to account for what the next crop is. Obvious about that is our cereal cover crops, such as cereal rye. They're grasses, they take up a lot of nitrogen, they have high to carbon nitrogen ratios. They're just not going to do really well ahead of a corn crop. They're actually going to do great. It's your corn crop that's going to have issues when they follow. Whereas ahead of soybeans, that might work fine. And then lastly, the ability to survive with the herbicide residual pressures we have out there. This is not a big issue when we look at our cereal cover crops. But if we want to get away from those and we start talking about wanting to get legumes out there or annual ryegrass or even some of the brassicas, a lot of the herbicides we apply come back and can actually still be active in the fall and give us some issues with getting those. Usually not established, but it really affects your overwinterability. So if you've struggled to put out like a legume or an annual ryegrass and it's not overwintering like you'd like to, you may want to go back through and review your herbicide program. And see what happens. Like I say, this isn't a big issue with like cereal rye is pretty bulletproof. All our cereals don't have a real big problem with this. But if you try to get away from those and want to get some of those other species into the mix, it can be a little difficult. So the species in particular, I talked about cereals. This is, I think, one of the best ways to break off this group because we talk a lot about cereal rye. But it isn't the only cereal out there. We have some other species that are actually pretty similar to it that can give us some pretty good benefits. So we're talking about barley, wheat, triticale, and I also have oats on there. Keep in mind, oats would not overwinter, and I believe they would be considered a cereal, but each of these are similar to cereal rye. They're going to have some of the similar characteristics, but they can give us a little bit more benefits. Barley is one that we've been talking about a lot more ahead of corn, for example. If you guys have struggled with cereal rye ahead of corn, I am really pretty against cereal rye ahead of corn. I do make a concession that if you're on highly erodible soils, it can make sense. If you're on a low yield, a lower yield environment, cereal rye might make sense. I work with a lot of farmers in heavy black flat soils where cereal rye ahead of corn has a lot of potential downside. It can be managed so that there isn't a negative, but there's a lot of management involved, and we really have to be careful with the downside. Using something like barley has been a lot more beneficial because, number one, it is a lot slower to get going in the springtime. So as we talk about termination, we talk about trying to terminate a head of corn a lot smaller. Well, if you miss those windows on cereal rye, boy, it just takes off. I mean, and it can get big on you really quick. Barley's going to be a little slower out the gate in the springtime. Its maximum height is also a lot lower than cereal rye. So if barley gets away from you, you're facing, you know, a monster about 3 foot tall instead of the monster 6 foot tall when it's cereal rye. So we've seen some pretty good benefits out of using barley. It is still a cereal. We still need to manage the nitrogen, but it can be something if we're looking for that cover crop to get out ahead of corn and we're needing to use a cereal cover crop, barley can work really well. It does need to be seeded earlier than cereal rye. The reason we use cereal rye is because it is the most winter hardy, will grow under any conditions, cover crop that's out there. So as we move away from that to any of these other species, we have to recognize we're usually going to have to get them seeded earlier, we're going to have to manage them a little bit differently. But we have seen pretty good success with barley. Triticale and wheat are other options. Oftentimes people go to them ahead of corn. They're definitely better than cereal rye. Unfortunately, triticale has always been touted as a good alternative ahead of corn. And the problem is if we don't get triticale terminated, it really isn't a lot smaller than cereal rye. I saw some plots last summer that they had let to go to maturity, and the cereal rye was 6 foot tall, the triticale was 5 foot, 6 foot tall. It was only about a half foot difference. So triticale can be better, but it could also put out a ton of biomass, and be very careful with what you're selecting for your triticale varieties because a lot of them are forage types that are out there. So make sure that you're trying to get more of a cover crop type. I had an issue last year with a grower who didn't get some terminated early. He had some fall anhydrous on. When that triticale tied into that fall anhydrous, oh my goodness, there was such good cattle forage out there because it was a forage type triticale, big wide leaf. It put out just a ton of biomass. So triticale can play a role for something like that. But if you're looking for an alternative ahead of corn, I would definitely steer you towards the barley. Then we talk about the grasses, annual ryegrass. I don't know if that gets used much up here. It gets used a lot down south. Probably the best cover crop out there. If I had one single species of cover crop to put out there, it would probably be annual ryegrass. Unfortunately, it isn't super winter hardy, and it is sensitive to some of our cover crops, and it is the one that is the most difficult to terminate in the springtime as well. So unfortunately, it doesn't get used that much, but for its benefits, it's probably the single best cover crop out there. Obviously, any of these thrown in a mix, basic mixes with grassine, legumes, and brassicas. Legumes, we struggle to really get a lot of establishment with them. Again, they're sensitive to some herbicides, but also just the overwintering aspect. We also have the issue when we look at a legume, if we want it to produce nitrogen, we gotta let it grow for a while in the springtime. Most of them need to get to the point where they're able to flower. And most of us don't wanna hold off planting corn that long. So we have this idea about producing nitrogen from it, but usually we're not gonna be managing them in such a way that they're gonna produce a lot of nitrogen. Plus, keep in mind, they're probably gonna scavenge the nitrogen that is out there first before they actually start producing the nitrogen. Another brassica, a couple quick things that I do have some seed samples in the back. But on the brassica side, for some of the mixes that are real easy if you're not using these already, rapeseed is definitely an easy one to throw in a lot of mixes. It's actually very winter hardy. It's a brassica. It's a small seeds per pound, or I'm sorry, it's a lot of seeds per pound. It's a small seed, so even a pound or two thrown into some cereal rye, something like that can get us some pretty good diversification. It is pretty cheap. It could overwinter on you, so keep that in mind. And then lastly is camelina. Has anybody used camelina yet? This one known some farmers started to use it 4 or 5 years ago. It is a brassica, it is an oil seed. You can buy camelina oil in some fancy grocery stores, but it seems to be one that can actually be seeded really late. And in fact, you want to seed it late. You don't want to seed it too early. It's one that if you seed it too early, it'll actually get through too much of its life cycle and die off. So we planted it into mid-November. I know other farmers that have planted it with their cereal rye fairly late and haven't come through the next year. So if you're looking for a little bit of that diversity, maybe rapeseed and camelina might be the two easiest ones to throw in there with some cereal rye. Camelina, it's not super impressive. It's okay. It gives a little bit of a taproot, puts out a yellow flower in the springtime. So on that picture on the left, what you see is some cereal rye planted with crimson clover in the middle. So the rye planted on 15 or 30-inch rows. And then on the right, we got some kind of biostrip tilling going on where there's either cereal or annual rye, and then some radishes that will winter kill in the middle. As a resource, if you're more interested in this herbicide thing, this is some older research that was done at the University of Missouri, where they went out and applied a number of these different herbicides. If you Google University of Missouri, herbicide carryover, it'll be it's still the first thing that comes up, although I think it's well over 10 years old, where they look at these different different herbicide packages and then gauge how effective these cover crops are when we seed them. So the way this chart works is green is they didn't have any observational problems, yellow is they saw some issues in 1 out of 3 years, and the red is they saw issues 2 out of 3 years. And if you look at this online, there's actually 4 or 5 different charts of this looking at soybean herbicides, corn herbicides, some different species. So you can look at it online, but it can help you kind of look at if you're really interested in getting some of these different species established, it can be worthwhile. Do keep in mind they did put out fairly heavy rates for this research trial, so it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to see a problem. Looking through some of these species, these are kind of the cereals on the left and right that I talked about. On your left in the middle, that's an annual ryegrass. So when we talk about these different species, annual ryegrass actually comes from the forage side and the turf side of things. So it isn't a cereal, it is more of a turf and forage grass, can make great livestock feed. And then we've got cereal rye there in the middle that are coming from the grain side of things. On the left, you've got some crimson clover and some balanza clover. Balanza clover has been pushed a lot more lately because the idea is, number one, it should be more winter hardy and hopefully would produce some nitrogen a little bit earlier than our crimson clovers. This picture on the inside in the middle is a farmer who was working with selective termination, so he had a cover crop of, I don't know if it was cereal rye or barley with crimson clover. He knew he was going to corn, so he went out and sprayed it really early with a clethodim product to kill off the grasses and to keep the legumes growing. So some farmers have kind of played around with that type of system, trying to keep the legumes growing for corn while terminating off the grasses. And then on the right, you have a nice combination of crimson clover and foxtail, a free cover crop. On the left, that's going to be like your rapeseed is going to put out a yellow flower. Camelina look pretty similar. Actually, that could be a pea looking at that. That's not a very good picture. But then we got hairy vetch on the far right. Hairy vetch is probably one of the more winter hardy legumes that we have, can produce a lot of nitrogen. The downside of it, a little bit more tricky to get it terminated, and it has a lot of hard seeds, so it will continue to come up on your farm for many years. And then we've got the good old brassicas, the tillage radishes, the turnips, all that type of fun stuff. So, and by the way, that's about the size your tillage radishes should be. We don't actually want the big, huge radishes. I still see that picture of Dave Brandt. I know it's so iconic, and he would have known, that's not what it should look like, obviously. But if you get them finger size, that's really what we want out of it to get the benefits out of it. So, all right, I'm going to shift gears to some of these other aspects. So, is there any questions on species before I move on specifically?
Tim, this isn't quite species, but before I forget it, you were planting when you were planting your cereal rye in 15-inch rows. You would obviously come back and plant your soybeans. Then you'd be going in the exact same place, right? Because
we would be offset. And yeah, we managed to do it offset a little bit, and a couple different ways to do that. Number one, if you're really good, there is kind of enough room to do it. Number two, if I'm gonna do,
That's not me.
number two, if we're gonna do it, I'm gonna plant the rye almost on top of the corn stalk row. But number three, the best thing to do is to do it at an angle in the field. Right, so just go across the field at an angle, and then plant your beans at an angle, then you get to combine your soybeans straight. Lots of guys like to combine it at an angle. If you plant at an angle, then you can go straight. So yeah, usually we would do it at a little bit of an angle so that we can follow that. But I have seen fields where it's been done straight with the row. Seeding rates, we won't go too in depth here. Biggest point, couple of points to be made here. If you're involved in a cost share program, they're probably gonna have some rules involved around what you have to put out there. Most of them in the state of Illinois default to the Midwest Cover Crop Council Selector tool. So that is an online, that's available online. So you can go on there and you can get an idea of what the rates are. Some of those have come down. It was kind of reevaluated about 5 or 6 years ago. So, something like cereal rye is as low as 30 pounds per acre pure life seed now if it's direct seeded. So I know some of those rates used to be really high. But do some research on that. We're not gonna go too much farther in depth on that, other than to say that particularly with the cereals, the earlier in the year you seed them, the lower the seeding rate you can go, because they will compensate and come back and tiller out just like a wheat crop will. There's actually some really good research from Nathan Johanning through the University of Illinois down south, where they did a number of different seeding rates, seeding dates, and showing like if you seed earlier enough in the year, the difference between 30 pounds per acre and 60 pounds per acre really didn't make any difference in terms of biomass as you got into the springtime. But again, it has to be seeded a little bit earlier in the year. That's not necessarily true if you're seeding late. So yeah, more is not always better. That's the other thing. Something like brassicas. I know if you guys planted some radishes, you probably know that. 6 pounds is a good solid stand of radishes. You don't want 10 pounds of radishes, or they start to compete with each other and start to hurt each other. So that's particularly true on the brassicas. And then just think through your seeding technique. Anything with the direct seeding, putting it directly on the ground is going to be, or in the ground and covered with seed to soil, is going to be a lot better than just broadcasting it. And in fact, most cost share programs will require higher seeding rates when you're doing a broadcast application. The application method needs to be timely for species and goals, needs to be reasonable for your available equipment, and it needs to be effective for producing a stand. So as we start moving into, we will spend some time with application methods. The biggest thing with application methods is, I heard this expression a while ago and it made a lot of sense, is you don't want the perfect to get in the way of the good. And I'm gonna relate this to you in the form of the drill, right? So the drill is probably the perfect way to get your cover crop established after a corn soybean harvest. But good Lord, they're slow, right? I got a 15-foot tie drill. I can do about 10 acres an hour. That's about how fast it goes when we use the drill. Will the drill give me a better solid stand for a lot of my goals than my 15-inch Kinsey planter? Yes. Is it worth me spending the extra time and not getting across all my acres? No, probably not. So some years I do use the drill. Some years we use the planter, kind of depending on the time that we have. I will even go so far as I have a neighbor who uses a broadcaster. He just goes out and spreads his rye on the field. And some years it looks perfect, some years it's not great. But I've literally been sitting in an 80-acre field, been halfway through the field, him show up to an 80-acre field next to me, 2 hours, he's pulling out of the field, going on to get his cover crop. I'm still working on that same 80-acre field, and I'm gonna be there for quite a while longer. So he's getting the job done, he's moving on, he's getting cover crops out there. By and large, he gets some pretty good benefits. So that's where the drill may be great, but there are other options. So we get farmers who, there's a lot of really good systems with blowing seed out there now. So we see blowers put on side dress bars, strip till bars, corn heads, soybean heads. Those can all be pretty good ways to do it. You just have to think through your species that you're trying to get out there, your seeding rates, things like that. Seeing some more interest in these applicators going on corn heads and soybean heads. It slows the farmer down at harvest a little bit, but a lot of them, they get it down to where it doesn't take a whole lot of their time, and when they leave that field, they're done. The cover crop's seeded, it's done in a timely manner, and they get to move on. I am going to make a quick comment about interseeding into standing crops. So you can see one picture up there that's got a Hagee applicator. That's at our farm. We have a local retailer that'll do that for us. And farther to the right is a video of an airplane that you won't be able to see, so I'm not going to play it. I do think we're going to see a resurgence in using these types of seeding methods because from what I'm seeing, we're going to want to move away from using those cereals, cover crops all the time. We're going to want those different levels of biomass. And in order to do that, we're going to have to get the species out there sooner. It is also a way to get it out of the farmer's responsibility. The number one complaint I hear from farmers about adopting cover crops is getting it seeded in the springtime. They just don't have the time or the labor to do that. So this allows them to get it done by a contractor, or at least get it done before harvest. But I'm going to challenge anybody who's going to do this. We have to change the way we think a successful field looks like. You are going to trade that picture-perfect stand, if you're going to do an aerial application, for more root structure and for different species. It's going to look different. I know a lot of farmers just think an aerial application was a failure, and sometimes they are. I'm like, sometimes they just don't work. I have to concede that. But I've also seen a lot of really good aerial applications that the farmer at first thinks, oh, this was a waste. Well, grab a shovel, let's go out in the field, let's start looking and start digging and see what's out there. You start digging roots and you find, first of December, you got roots that are already a foot, 18 inches tall versus the cereal rye you just seeded a couple weeks ago where you only got a couple inches. So if I'm just doing cereal rye, I'm probably not going to be worried about this, but again, if I want to get to those other species, I'm not as averse to these seeding methods as some people are. Using the planter, these are just some of the things that you have to do if you want to get your planter going. Do a little bit of research. The information's out there. Basically, it's like seeding wheat or something like that. You gotta, there's some limitations, like you're not gonna be able to seed straight rapeseed out of these types of things because it's such a small seed, but you can usually mix it in with your larger seeds and get some of that out there. So there'll probably be a little trial and error if you go this route with the planter, especially if you're wanting to get away from those larger seeded cereals, but most likely there's some ready-made discs for your planter for getting those products on. Some of the benefits of the planter, as Russ was kind of alluding to, the idea of having an open space. This is really big on corn, and we're starting to see more of that benefit from soybeans, again, as I talked about planting soybeans a little bit earlier. So it can be very beneficial to be able to plant down a row that doesn't have direct competition from a cover crop. So on the left, you see it's a picture of a drill that just has a plugged up row. So you have 3 7.5 inch strips and then an open strip. I was really excited about this idea. I was going to do this to my drill, and I found out I have a gosh darn 8-inch wide drill. It's not 7.5 inches, it's 8 inches. So that really made me mad. Didn't realize that for a few years after I bought it. So not all drills are 7.5 inch spacings, but that is a possibility, or using just the Kinsey planter, or even planting in 30-inch rows. So I apologize again, I'm sure you probably can't quite see that picture, but that picture is one of the reasons I originally wanted to start looking at barley. And I say I want to lay out, I have no original ideas. I work with farmers. Anything I say, I've seen another farmer do or bring out. So none of this is me coming up with great ideas. There were guys using barley long before I was. But this was taken in 2019. If you guys remember 2019, a lot of fields didn't get planted, a lot of plant acres. And this farmer planted cereal rye. He planted barley. He actually planted radishes in the skip row with this Kinsey planter. The radishes died off, and he was left with this barley. And this picture was taken, I think, in late June, and that barley was about this tall. He had a nice wide open strip to plant his corn into. He had no concerns about the allelopathic effects, any of that, and he got some benefit out of it. So that was one of the first eye-openers for me for potentially using barley. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to just termination. We'll spend just a couple minutes on this, and then I'll wrap up. When do we terminate our cover crops? That's the biggest thing. And it's not necessarily the time by the calendar, which can be important, but to me the number one issue when I want to terminate, particularly my cereal cover crops, is based on growth stage. Has anybody seen a soil health presentation where they talk about the livestock under the soil? Sometimes they'll even do some animations. They'll have 6 Holstein steers under there. The one guy had, it was like 4 elephants. The biomass of bacteria, the biomass of biology under the soil. That's how much biology is in like the top 6 or 8 inches. It's this huge amount of biology. Well, if I'm going to think about cover crops as feeding my biology, feeding the livestock in the soil, and again, that's terms that I've heard other people use. I raise livestock. So if I'm thinking about feeding my cows, yeah, I'm worried about quantity, but quality matters a lot too. Does anybody here raise livestock? Cattle? Anybody ever sent away for a forage test? When they do a forage test, what's one of the number one things we look at is going to be protein, right? When we think about quality forage, we think about protein. If I'm thinking about feeding the soil, feeding my livestock in the soil, I'm going to think about that quality of it, and that's going to relate back to carbon to nitrogen ratio. Because when you do a protein test, if you're doing a standard nutrient test and not asking for anything fancy, all they're doing is measuring nitrogen. And they're actually taking at times, I think, 6.25% to get what your protein level is. So when we start talking about carbon to nitrogen levels in soils, I want you to think about it in that regard, right? I'm thinking about it in terms of how much protein does that have, how digestible will it be for my soil, and how quickly will it break down. So I'm sure you've heard the carbon to nitrogen ratios, but that ideal microbial diet is about that 24 to 1. We're just going to highlight real quick, because I know I'm pretty well close to the time, how cereal rye kind of goes through those stages. Cereal rye at the vegetative stage, so before anthesis, is 26 to 1. That's actually pretty good. And if you've ever harvested cereal rye for livestock feed, if you get it at the right time, it's got some pretty good protein. We've gotten like 11% protein out of cereal rye, baled it for some cattle. But as we move up and we get to anthesis, we've quickly gone from 26 to 1 to 27 to 1. Anybody familiar with cereal rye knows that can take about a week. And then we move from 37 to 1, we get up to that fully mature rye straw. We're at 82 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, which is above wheat straw, it's above corn stalks, it's above everything. So again, building that idea that we want to terminate our cover crop. When I think about termination, I'm wanting to terminate based on growth stage. Where is that rye? So that it will break down quickly, it'll go back to the soil, it won't have a negative impact on my cover crop. Whether I plant green or not then is a management strategy for me. With us planting soybeans so much earlier in the year, as I said, most likely we're planting green at this point. The idea of terminating and then coming back 2 weeks later, for most guys, isn't necessarily going to be in the book. So, last comments on termination, then I'll wrap things up. Some resources, and again, I saw Elise had these resources on her list, so I didn't have her add it. Still, the best resources I've seen for the basics of terminating cover crops, looking at the chemistry, are some bulletins that Purdue University put out almost 10 years, maybe 15 years ago now. They are still, again, if you Google them, they're going to be one of the top things that come up, and they're going to walk you through what you should be doing in terms of getting your water conditioned properly, what tank mixes to avoid, how to go about getting successful cover crop termination. I will make a note that they have 2 of them. One of them is straight cover crop termination. They have one devoted entirely to terminating annual ryegrass. So I mentioned annual ryegrass earlier. One of its downsides is getting it terminated. So if you work with that, take a look at that. Biggest watch out of putting atrazine with your glyphosate or metribuzin on the soybean side, because it can cause some issues with making the glyphosate work properly. You can use those chemistries in a cover crop system. You just need to be careful if you're actually adding them to your glyphosate. They cause antagonism and making it not work as well. It will still work about 80% of the time. And that's the problem. I'll say this, and farmers will come back, well, I do that all the time. I will tell you, working with almost 80 to 100 farmers across the state of Illinois, as we go through and we learned, okay, a farmer had an issue with cover crop termination. We can usually go back and find these tank mixes in the mix. Doesn't happen every time. If it's annual ryegrass, you better watch it. It will happen every time. But our other species, it doesn't happen every time. But best management practices. Lastly, I will say, if you have a legume or a brassica in the mix, glyphosate alone in the springtime doesn't do a very good job. That's when we want to introduce a 2,4-D product, something like that to take care of those, sharpen, something like that. So, I think I'm kind of at my time. I apologize for rushing through any of that. So I think I'm going to go ahead and quit there, but I would be happy to answer any questions. Yes, sir.
Do you find there's more degradation in the corn stalks we got one farmer doing the rye. It seems like the stalks are more broke down, they're more black, kind of more rotted where the cereal rye's at. And we're planting green.
Yeah, especially once the system gets going, I mean, a couple things are going to happen. Even in the first year, by having that rye out there, how do they get it seeded? You know, unfortunately, some of our drills are as aggressive as a vertical tillage tool. So there might have been some working up of that. Nonetheless, you're making more of a humid environment there that's going to help rot off. But once you get a few years into this, you are going to have that better biology, and we can document that with the, if you guys have ever seen the soil uranities test out there, I mean, those are kind of fun to put out there. Anybody ever heard? Do that up there, right? You take cotton underwear, you know, true cotton underwear, and you bury it about 5 inches under a no-till healthy soil, and you take it and you bury one in a tillage system, and you wait, you know, 6 to 8 weeks. If it's in the summertime, you bury it up, and you can see the differences in how quickly the microbes degraded on the no-till system, and you can pull up almost perfectly clear ones in the tillage system. So then, and certainly earthworms, you know, those, you get that earthworm population going, and they can really start to break down those residues that are out there. So yeah, that is absolutely something that can happen after time.
Well, I've been watching too much television. I've been kind of concerned about the weather. And it seems to me like your cover crop, and if we get a really dry year, I mean, drier than even Dust Bowl type dry, that your cover crop is going to detract from the moisture that your crop needs.
In Illinois, that is generally not a big issue because we usually have adequate spring moisture. So if we're terminating early, then we have the benefit, the cover crop provides the benefit of actually holding moisture in. Once it's dead, then it's no longer sucking the moisture out. And so I have seen a few instances where we've had issues with stands where a cover crop has pulled too much moisture out early in the year and just dried the soil out. And you know, farmers didn't get the stand right away, but they usually replanted. We usually get the rains, and those dry years are usually where we get the benefit of the cover crop because they hold that moisture in. They really keep that soil a lot cooler through the springtime till the crop gets canopy. Definitely out west, I mean, their crop insurance rules are different. You know, you go to Kansas and you have to have it terminated like 2 weeks before planting because of those concerns. But usually we see a benefit from the cover crop in a dry year. It's the wet years that probably hold us back more on cover crops.
What have you learned from, at least locally, the last 2 years have been incredibly dry in the fall, well into the fall? What, any words of advice trying to start a cover crop?
Yeah, unfortunately, some of these years would have been those later seedings of something like cereal rye and barley when we got the moisture. So I've definitely seen some, well, most of the guys that I worked with doing aerial applications did catch rains. There's a few instances of out-and-out failures. And I will say that's the key with an aerial application is you gotta know when to keep the seed in the bag. I mean, you have to have some moisture out there and you have to have some moisture coming. So yeah, a lot of that really does come down to you're gonna be more successful than getting later in the year, hoping for those rains, planting something such as cereal rye, barley, that will be there till you get the rain. Applications on top of the soil can be a real problem, especially if you have those earthworms going, because those earthworms can really come out and eat any seed that's up on the soil surface. So if it's dry, that idea that we're just gonna broadcast it on the top and wait for a rain usually doesn't work out if you've got a good earthworm population, because about a week or two into it, they're gonna be eating all the seed. So you wanna get, and that's where you'll actually be more successful if you don't have healthy soil, because there's nothing out there to eat it. So yeah, those can be a struggle, planting later, and that's, again, we didn't talk a lot about the mixes component of the species selection, but by having those different species in there, you always maybe would have at least a base of a cereal rye, barley, something like that, that you can come in and seed later, that will take off later. It has been a little bit of an issue though. I mean, I know farmers that have seed to soil contact is gonna be huge though when you do that. Those broadcast applications don't work great. And if you want more non-answers, ask me about slugs and volts. I'll give you some more non-answers. All right, I appreciate the time. I'll be around if anybody has any questions.
divide up our panel. So if Dave, Ben, and Scott, if you'd like to come up, I will go ahead and pull up our discussion questions. Alright, thank you for all for being here. We have about 10 or so questions. We'll get through as many as we can, but what we're gonna do is I'll have them up on the screen here, and I'll ask each question, and then you can each take a turn answering, or if you wanna skip, that's perfectly fine too. And then if anyone in the audience has anything that they'd like to share retaining to any of the questions, feel free to raise your hand and we can kind of have a discussion. All right, so our first question, I'm sorry, I didn't introduce you. So this is Scott Lager. He is an agronomy rep with CHS, and he's also on the board of the Illinois Nutrient Research and Education Council, NREC. This is Ben Moe. He's a Kendall County farmer, and he's been using cover crops for many years. Same as Dave Schlapp. He's also a Kendall County farmer, so they have a lot of knowledge between the three of you, so I'm excited to have you share. So now we'll go ahead and get started with the questions. Can you share about how you got started using cover crops and how long you've been using them in your crop rotation? Scott, if you want to share what you've learned from working with your customers.
Yeah, that's the basis of my experience. I farm myself over on Lockport. My family settled on a rock pile over there in the 1870s, and we're still there. And I farm a little bit in Livingston County as well on some Class A soils. But and then, as Elise indicated, my full-time job is sales agronomy work at CHS. So I have a number of growers that I work with that I help them, get cover crops established, help them get terminated, and just help with general management. So my growers got started using cover crops, primarily, looking at their goals, and Jim was spot on. The first consideration is what do you want to achieve, by using cover crops. In the case of many of my growers, we're on Class C plus to B minus soils, so poorer soils. They're looking at building soil structure, using cereal rye in particular with its fibrous root system really helps build soil structure, soil health, and help keep soil in place. Where we're at, we do roll quite a bit. And the cereal rye primarily. We've done also some, after wheat, we've done some warm season covers such as radishes and whatnot with good success as well. But primary goals are to keep soil in place and to build structure. And as an added benefit, we're also immobilizing nutrients, phosphorus, nitrogen in particular. And I want to thank Elise and Jim both for their mentioning of the Illinois NREC program, which I'm a part of here, serving out a term as a director. So goals are important, and in our case, structure and holding nutrients and soil in place is the primary objectives of my guys.
Ben, would you like to share?
Sure. I farm with my three brothers down in southwest Kendall County, and we started farming probably about 18 years ago. And we dabbled in cover crops primarily to deal with compaction and weed issues initially. But then we really got going in cover crops when we signed up for the CSP 5 years, we basically were compensated for trying different cover crops, and we did experiment, made a lot of mistakes. We didn't have much luck seeding in aerially seeding cereal rye, because it just created more problems than what was worth. But we're wheat farmers primarily, so we've got a wheat, soybean, corn rotation. So we, for cover crop, we use primarily the oats, radishes, turnips, and so those are the ones that we are currently using. We did experiment with some rapeseed, which we had trouble terminating that, so we kind of knocked that out. We intend to continue using cover crops, probably that little formula that we're currently using, because the wheat usually goes on pretty low quality soil. So we have C and B type soils, and we've noticed that the productivity of the land has increased considerably by using the cover crops. And when corn comes up in rotation, we co-op that out to a neighbor, and he likes to have as clean a field as possible. But we usually get a really good stand of radishes and turnips and oats, which all hopefully terminate during the year. And that really does capture a lot of the nitrogen. We put on biosolids after the wheat comes out, so it really gets a good shot. So we get a really good stand of ground cover. And it holds those nutrients there for future crops to be planted in. So.
Dave, do you want to share?
I'm Dave Schlapp, we farm over by Oswego. We got quite a bit of HEL ground, and we got good ground too. But I got hooked up with doing through CSP, Conservation Stewardship. We've got ground we've no-tilled since 1996, and it's helped the soil. We do it for erosion, but when I got hooked up with CSP, I wanted to try the rye. I use cereal rye, and we put it on corn stalks in the fall, followed with soybeans, and I think it's helping. It's helping with our water, our erosion. It's been a learning curve, but there's been mistakes. And when I got questions, I call Scott, because we've done corn, we've done bean stubble also, and followed with corn, and but overall, I signed up again for it. CSP, they help cost share it, and we go on with some other programs, but I've been happy with it. We signed up again. We're doing it because it's a 5-year contract. We do it on our home farm because we know we're there to stay. I don't want to get caught when the farm gets sold by Oswego and I can't finish out my contract, but we just cereal rye, we've been really happy with it.
Great, thank you. Our next question, which Ben and Dave touched on a little bit, but describing your crop rotation and how the inclusion of cover crops fits into your overall plan for maintaining soil health and optimizing yields. So I guess if anyone has anything to add with that question, you can feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I'll just add that, the couple of growers over in my neighborhood that I work with that way, they are using cereal rye after both corn and after soybeans. Both direct seeding with a Kinsey, similar to what Jim's doing, and broadcasting, with a fertilizer buggy after harvest. As soon as harvest out, there's enough labor, and the one family in particular that my friend can have his son, right behind the combine with the tool that way, either or. He's had fairly good success both ways with broadcast and the planter. Rates are different, probably others have described. The broadcasting, can be a little bit more difficult to achieve decent results, especially the last couple of falls. We've been particularly dry. You may not see any green haze as you drive past, but if you do walk the field, you will see a little bit of, this is in December, for example, you will see a little bit of activity. And then after the first couple of rains, about this time of year, you'll actually see an explosion. So we're not getting a lot of fall growth, but we're getting some pretty good early growth, late growth rather, ahead of planting. It's still possible over that direction to get 10 to 12 inches or better of growth out of a cover crop that doesn't appear to be doing anything even March 1st. So pretty remarkable, really.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that was part of the CSP program was that we conducted a Haney soil test, which is a test which measures basically the soil health. And they come up with a number, I'm not sure exactly how to measure the number, but if it keeps going up, it means you're doing okay. And it really did increase pretty dramatically on some of our lower quality ground. That we saw the numbers increase pretty substantially. So it's a different way of looking at what's done.
On our corn stalks, we just spread it with our fertilizer. This year I did tickle some with just an old John Deere disc with narrow blade spacings. But the year we had it on bean stubble, we did have that drilled in. And the stand was perfect. We put 50 pounds on. And I was a little more worried. We do use starter. We've used starter forever. And that was, I called Scott because I was a little worried. We didn't get it burned down very early. We learned that year, the rye will be that tall when we plant, whether it be corn. We've never had an issue. We got a case IH planter, it plants through it fine. Never had any trouble with wrapping or nothing. It's rooted down deep enough, it just actually, if you don't have auto steer, it'd be kind of a bear, because you can barely tell where you're at. But we've been happy with it. We had like in 21, I think we got it down early on corn stalks, and it had a nice green mat, in the fall. But now, every other year since, because I've been starting my second 5 years, we'll put it on after the corn's off, and you might not see it do a thing. It might just be, you start getting some rains in the spring, and all of a sudden you just see the green mat start turning green. The one thing we've learned, planting with it green and it's headed out, you got keep tracking the radiator. You get that fine dust. Tractor started getting warm out. We had that problem last year. We thought the air quit. We thought the air conditioner was going bad, and went to the shop and popped the hood, and the radiator, it was just real fine dust, and washed it out, and it was fine. So we kind of learned when we get done with the rye, clean it out good. But that's been we've had other issues too.
Okay, how have you gone about selecting the right cover crops for different soil types and other site conditions on your farm? And do you use different species or mixes for different conditions? You want to start?
Sure. We're primarily, my growers are primarily the cereal rye. For the fibrous root, architecture in particular, that way. And it's kind of just the easiest to manage, with the on a corn soybean rotation. As I did mention, after a wheat crop, they will sometimes try a little bit of a rye radish mix, in that late August, September timeframe. And then the radishes will winter kill, as Jim had mentioned. One consideration with the radishes in an urban area, when they do a frost kill, about this time of year or in February, after you get a little bit of a warm up, you will get a sulfur odor out of those as those decompose. And it can be quite pungent. So if you're near subdivisions and, or any kind of an urban fringe, you may have some neighbors looking cross-eyed at you. Maybe a 4 to 10 day period, depending on weather.
After they call the gas company or before?
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it does smell like a natural gas leak at best. At worst, you know, it smells like manure, whatnot. But the radishes, they do provide some additional macro type tillage, you know, create macro pores, which can be quite helpful. And I would add too, just backing up a couple, the growers that I'm working with that are using covers are committed to long-term no-till. They've been no-tilling 30 plus years. And, you know, in our situation where we're at with our soil types, to reintroduce tillage would probably set back the whole soil structure aspect of what they're trying to achieve, you know, their primary goal. Where we come from, if it's fit enough to plant, you better be planting. If you open it up with any kind of a tillage tool, then you're going to need to knock it back down with 2 additional tillage passes to get it into plantable shape. Our soils generally go from being too wet to rock hard in about 6 hours. So you've got a fairly narrow window for optimum planting.
Ben, with your mixes that you've used in the past, do you switch it up with different soil and site conditions?
Well, we usually, we don't mix it up that much. We also participate in another program where we get compensated for putting the cover crops in and including a legume in it. So we try to get it planted in by the middle of August, so it all gets established pretty well. But we have been using pretty much the same, except changing that legume out periodically. But we don't really, haven't been changing it around for soil types.
And Dave, you primarily do cereal rye,
We're
right?
just rye, we just don't seem to get beans out early enough. If we throw wheat into the rotation, I think I would try some more of that, you know, something like that. But for when we harvest, you just don't get that early, you know, that nice weather to get that enough out of the ground. Where the rye, cereal rye is very forgiving. I mean, it's just root wise, just seed it and don't worry about it. I mean, my first year, I know I was kind of worried because it didn't get up out of the ground in the fall because it was, you know, following corn, and all of a sudden, I mean, April, it just starts getting a green hue to it. And by the time planting green, we kind of got into it by accident. That was the corn, and going into soybeans, because we've had years, we learned the hard way, if you're gonna spray it down before you plant, you better hope it don't rain, because there's enough mat there that it could take a long time to dry. And it was a wet spring, and I can say planting green, it's a new mindset, but it works. It really does.
Great. What specific benefits have you observed from incorporating cover crops? I know we've kind of touched on some. If you have any other thoughts you want to share, feel free.
Yeah, you know, just backing up to the soil structure, building soil structure, erosion control, and less quantifiable, although you can kind of tell by how robust and how green the rye is, but nutrient, you know, nitrogen immobilization. You know, part of what we want to accomplish statewide, you know, with the Illinois nutrient laws is keeping plant food where it belongs, not, keeping it in the soil for our crops, not leaving in tile lines or leaving across the field in surface runoff. And, cover crops certainly benefit that way. And Jim did actually touch upon weed control as well, particularly in corn stalks going to soybeans. We've experimented with a number of different termination dates, planting green, terminating early, terminating late, and depending on if you've got the stomach for it, the late termination, and again, Dave touched on the mat, the moisture holding capabilities of the crop as well, depending on the spring. But late termination can certainly help with weed control. We've seen that, we've documented it, particularly difficult species such as the water hemp that we've been battling in this neck of the woods.
Ben, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. Planting of the radishes and the turnips, they've got a really deep tap root. We find that, that does open up the soil quite a bit, so that, if things dry out a little faster in the springtime to get out and plant, we plant our beans early. So that's the first thing we're out there planting, so that really helps get us jump on that. So it does open up the soil. And the microbial activity and the root structure, as it builds up the organic matter, holds the moisture.
Dave?
Planting when it's green, the soil tilth is just unbelievable. I mean, you can work the ground. It seemed like when we worked the dirt, you struggled. You might work it 3 times to get the soil structure you want, but when you're planting the right that tall, you dig down to the seed and it's just crumbly, loose dirt. I mean, it's 23 was a very dry spring, and it planted fine, and we don't usually plant beans, maybe 1 3/4 inches, and we probably put them at 2 inches in 23 because it was getting dry. It stayed dry, and there was beans that started to grow. There was beans 3 weeks later, looked like you just planted them. In the end, they all came up and yielded fine. I mean, it was just, we got burned one year when we sprayed it early because then it rained, and we just drug our feet. I mean, we planted those beans in June, which we were still in with for our insurance date, but I was bound to determine, the ground's been no-tilled a long time. I just not want to touch it. Luckily, it was only 120 acres, but you learn patience as a virtue, because it's, and you just gotta go by your gut. In 19, we did wheat, a lot of cover crop and prevented plant, we put wheat in. That was before I got started with CSP. And wheat, the root structure on wheat is entirely different. We went to no-till into it. It was just this mass of, it was just solid roots with hardly any dirt. Or with the rye, it's a long stringy root, and you got a ton of dirt. I mean, it closed the seed slot fine. And even in 23 though, we had problems with army worms. We didn't notice it when we planted them, but then we kill it after we plant, and I got a hayfield right beside it. And I just come out of the driveway one day in the tractor, and I look out in the hay, and it's like, holy crap. You could just turn it down the stems. So the army worms moved out of the rye because we killed it into the hay. We had to get the hay off quick, and then we sprayed the hay for the army worms, and then we did have to spray some of the, because they might have moved back into the soybeans, once there was nothing left of the hay to eat. But it all worked out fine. I mean, it seems like it's a very forgiving cereal rye for what we're doing. We just don't get enough. I'd like to try other stuff, cover crops, but I think I'd have to go with wheat. They have the time frame to get it planted. Get it up and rolling.
Okay, thank you. All right. What challenges, I know Dave just some challenges, but any other challenges that have been faced when integrating cover crops? Do you want to share?
Sure. Well, just this past spring, over in my neighborhood, we had a situation where we made a great effort to get out early, to get things terminated when they needed to be. And just a word about termination, serial rye termination. You need to wait for a string of good days, some warm up, moving out of the late winter or into early spring. You want to try to get into a situation in which you're in the 50s and 60s for several days. You don't want overnight lows to get back down into the low 30s. You want to try to find a spell where you can, get out, during a good warm spell. And again, Jim mentioned termination timing, I think, in that 12 to 24 inch range. I think that's fairly key, that's fairly critical in most cases. And this spring, we had a situation where we got rained out. We had a good run for a day. Had a situation where we were rained out for up to 3 weeks, or maybe even a little bit longer. And the rye took off. And this was bean stubble going to corn. And my friend and neighbor planted it green, went ahead and planted it green. And the same day, within a day of planting, we were able to get in. It was fit enough, obviously. It was fit enough to plant again, so it was fit enough to spray. So we got it sprayed, got it killed quickly. And the key with my cooperator is working with corn, cereal rye with corn. Jim had mentioned, and Dave as well, starter fertilizer and having a nitrogen source early in the root zone, near the root zone, is key in order to mitigate carbon nitrogen types of situations that Jim had mentioned, from the quick decomposition and mineralization of the plant residue. The particular starter blend that I have made for my grower, it's 50 units of nitrogen along with some phosphorus and a little bit of sulfur, utilizing 32% nitrogen, 1034O, and some ammonium thiosulfate. And that's placed in a 2x2 band, 2 inches to the side, 2 inches below. And we were both pretty concerned about how if that system was going to be adequate with terminating, basically in the boot stage. And luckily, the crop didn't miss a beat. We got a good quick kill. The corn emerged, great color, and yield monitor showed that we had no yield loss between the strip of rye that got killed late and the rye that got killed in a timely fashion. So that was a key challenge that's mitigated by starter fertilizer, which is a very important part of the process. And then Dave mentioned pests, slugs, and also armyworms can be an issue when you kill late. Armyworms, if they've infested the cover crop gets terminated, they'll move into the corn crop, or soybean crop for that matter, and cause problems. So those are our real world challenges that are out there.
We've had a couple of occasions when we follow beans or wheat, when you have beans following wheat, and you have a real good stand of cover crop, which includes radishes and turnips. In the springtime, as they're decaying, and you planted your beans, you seem to have a
'23 was the only year we had problems with the army worms from the rye. The year we did this, where we followed corn with it, we did, we used 918.9, it's the Andersons. Some call it snake oil, but we've been using it for years. We did put Pivot Bio in where we did the rye. They had more in, because we don't put in with the planter, we just use starter. And we came back over the top with 32, then we came back in with side dressed. You know, we split shot our end. But the corn, the field we did was a good experiment because it was a 200 some acre field, 80 acres of it was rye, drilled in rye in the fall. So we planted the beans, and it was on my son's ground, and so we assumed it was gonna get burned down, and it wasn't. So that's when I called Scott, I said, we're gonna plant this green, first time we did it. Luckily, we used starter and we had Pivot Bio, and it maybe had a little bit of a color difference, but in the end, it was like a third to a half a point wetter. I mean, and actually the corn, it was the same corn, I quit planting it to rye, went and planted mine. Came back, probably 4 or 5 days later, went with the same number, planting again, and it pretty much evened it all. As far as emergence, I would say it was pretty even, other than it had a little bit of a color variation, but in the end, the yield, it's as longer we're with it, the more happy we are with it. You know, things you're thinking we're gonna really take a bath on this, and we didn't. It turned out good. And that was in '22. That year we did that.
All right, for sake of time, I think we'll go ahead and skip to our last question. I'm curious about your thoughts on this. What advancements in planting and termination technology do you see as being most impactful for improving the efficiency and effectiveness of cover crop management? Do you guys have thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, from a practical standpoint, Jim touched on, the early seeding, and we've done a little bit of that too. We've done some aerial work and with mixed results. Again, it all depends on the year. Jim talked about equipping combines and sprayers, with seeding equipment, to get things out earlier that way. Termination, the chemistry is the chemistry, and it's effective. Again, we need to give it the best chance for success by proper timing as to the best of our ability. But I can't think of anything offhand that, in terms of advancements, that would be topics for discussion.
Well, when we signed up for that CSP program, we basically switched over to no-till drill then. So we've been using no-till drill. We found that very effective in handling the soil and planting our cover crops, during August in that time frame. So, but we've had difficulty trying to figure out how to get cereal rye down in the standing crop anyway, or after a corn or soybean crop. So I think those setting up something to spread it behind the combine would make a lot of sense.
Dave, do you have anything to add?
I think we've no-tilled for years and years. I mean, we don't touch the ground at all. And it seems like with the straight no-till, that 5th year up into your 8th year, maybe 9th year, the no-till, if it's not a good spring, can be very hard to deal with. And where you almost want to say you quit it. And I think with the rye, because it helps that soil number one, you're building your organic matter, but the root structure makes that soil more forgiving at planting. If you have our springs, you never know what it's gonna be, and, like in a wet spring, that no-till, we've no-tilled enough years where it's getting manageable, but I think the rye would take that that fifth year, when the no-till's getting rough, I think it would make it easier, it makes the ground transform quicker, is my thoughts on it. It just, every time we planted in that rye, it's just this crumbly dirt, it just looks good. Where you get the years, if it's a damp year, I mean, your seed slot is just in chunks, you're not crumbling it up good. And we run spade on that IH planter, we run the spade wheels to help break up. I mean, we got fields where you have black dirt, side hills clay, the top of it's timber soil, and you get in some of them in that ground, it varies so much. And I think this rye is where it's helping to ease that, it's making the ground more forgiving, is my take. We try to do things as cheap as we can, and I don't want, you could spend money on iron all day long, and to have the right tool for the right condition, I think the rye kind of helps take that away.
Great, thank
Jim,
you.
do you have anything to add for number 10 in terms of advancements, technology that way?
Well, the big thing I've seen in the last year is drone demonstrations. I mean, so that's probably as far as technology goes,
Right.
that would be the one everybody's kind of excited about is seeing drones out there. Which is an aerial application, but gives a little more versatility is all to the farmers.
All right, thank you. If anyone has some questions, we'll take a couple minutes. Yes, Nancy?
I feel like you sort of referenced this, but have you seen a significant change in yield for your crops once you started using cover crops?
Our wheat yields on, our Class C soils, we did 118 bushels an acre overall on wheat this year.
It's
So
good.
that's what we've done. Yeah, we've seen an improvement in yields, definitely.
And same way over east around home, where we've improved soil structure and soil health, through a combination of long-term no-till, again, on the more marginal soils, C plus and B minus soils. No-till, in conjunction with cover crops is definitely ideal. We've just seen it over the years. And again, that's a function of just increasing soil health. Marginal soils respond to more management that way.
Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, if you use a herbicide to terminate your cover crop, do you have to use a higher rate than you normally would for just weeds or?
Not necessarily, that's where, trying to get it terminated on the earlier side, trying to balance the biomass, and the weather. Cereal rye will terminate fairly easily with modest rates of glyphosate.
But, okay, now that herbicide was like the weeds that are gonna come up after the cover crop is terminated, or do you have to follow it again with another herbicide?
Well, Jim talked a little bit about the benefits of in a lot of cases it is true, where your chances of good termination success come from the single application of the glyphosate without tank mix partners. I've been fortunate enough in most of my cases where I am using multiple products, pre-emerge products along with the glyphosate, and so far I haven't had any real failures that way.
And I will note that most other products, than what I mentioned, are okay.
Right.
But we just see the issues with that
Yeah.
atrazine you mentioned, using, so there's a lot of.
And I have used atrazine, and again, I've been fortunate. I haven't experienced any real issues, but those issues are out there.
But you are using more herbicides with the cover crop than you would be if you
Correct, to terminate, but everything's a trade-off, otherwise, tillage. In our case, tillage sends soil down the hill, and fuel usage, and in our case, destroys soil structure, so.
And I would say numerous farmers are actually removing their residual applications in the spring, right? Normally, if we did a burn down on no-till, we do the glyphosate to kill the cover crop, and then or to kill the weeds, and then we have other chemistries. A lot of them are moving those chemistries later in the year.
Correct.
So they are kind of able to actually reduce their herbicide uses that way by not having so much up front because of the rise of the job, so. It all
Yeah, it's a
depends.
shift that way.
It all depends.
So it seems to me if the rye got tall, like you said, it would be hard to kill with herbicide.
Cereal rye, usually, that may be where you increase your rates a little bit, but we can usually get it killed, say, one way or the other, if it's applied properly.
Great, thank you.
I'll just make one final comment, again, about NREC. The Illinois Nutrient Research Education Council, that I'm a part of here in the short term, through a term. It was founded in 2012 as it's farmer funded, 75 cents, and that's actually gonna be going up to $1 a ton for fertilizer for 2025. It's been 75 cents a ton assessment since its inception in 2012 to fund nutrient research, cover crop research, all with the goal of addressing the Illinois nutrient loss reduction strategy, to develop practices, that in conjunction with outreach, farmer outreach, real projects, real practices that farmers can implement to better manage nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus in particular. And Elise did make several copies of our NREC's latest cover crop guide, which she does have on the table. And I would also encourage you to just Google Illinois NREC, and there are a number of other good items on that site. Annual reports where you can see the breadth of our project base, going back, around 14 years that way, 13 years. A number of YouTube videos in which researchers discuss their specific project, and they really get into the weeds in terms of what they're doing. And then there's also annual reports highlighted on the website so that you can see what these projects have yielded, many of which are multi-year projects, particularly the cover crop projects. So, thanks.
Thank you. And we do have the meat raffle